Hello, and welcome to our second lecture. This one is about the Constitution of the United States. In my opinion, probably actually, the most important document ever written in English. We're going to discuss how the Constitution, why we got the Constitution that we have, and the role that it plays in our history and continues to play today. But in getting started, we need to actually define what a constitution is. And your sort of formal textbook definition is going to be a document or series of documents that establish the rules and procedures for how a society should be governed. It's important to note that a constitution doesn't actually have to be a written document or even a single document. In Great Britain, for instance, they don't have a written constitution. Instead, they have a series of documents, precedents, and traditions going back to the Magna Carta, and including things like the English Bill of Rights and other court decisions over the years. The U.S. Constitution is notable for being the longest surviving written constitution in the world. Why has it survived so long? One reason may be that it can be changed. We have an amendment process for it, which we have used throughout our history 27 times, which is actually not that many when you consider the Constitution has now been the rule of the land for 230 years, so less than one every 10 years. Of course, if you consider too that the first 10 amendments were added at the time the Constitution was adopted, we've only really had about 17 amendments in 230 years, so we have not changed it much, is the point I'm making. All right, so why do we have the Constitution we have today? Well, it goes back to the fact that we began as a series of colonies, British colonies on the eastern seaboard. And we were certainly under British law at that time, and the Constitution has its roots in English law. For the jumpstart towards our Constitution began with the French and the Indian War. You probably, if you've taken American history class or a Western Civ class, you may know that the French and Indian War was a North American theater of the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, and the French and Indian War was basically a control of the continent of North America. So the English and the colonials together on one side and some Native Americans versus the French and their Native American allies on the other side. And the good news for the British is they won. The bad news is that war is expensive. And to pay for this war, the English Parliament began imposing some restrictions and some taxes on the colonies. The first restriction is going to be the Sugar Act. This was a list of items that could only be exported from the colonies to Great Britain. You could probably figure out the most significant of these was sugar. This is bad news for the colonials because if they can only sell it to the British, that means that they're going to get a lower price for it. On the open market, where you have multiple potential consumers, they can bid against each other. The next act was going to be an act passed by Parliament was the Stamp Act, and this is a tax on virtually all paper used by the colonists. And this was unpopular, but ultimately it was repealed a year later and replaced with the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts was another series of taxes on various imports. And it's here that opposition to these taxes really kicked up a notch. I mean, there was opposition to the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act too, but the Townshend Act following this, colonists mobilized against it, and there were violent protests against the Townshend Acts, especially in Boston, which is going to be a hotbed of opposition to the British, and later on, hotbed of support for independence. There were violent protests there even. It's also here that Patrick Henry famously exclaimed, "No taxation without representation." Actually, I'm sorry, Patrick Henry did say that. That became the rallying cry for the colonials. Okay, so you may know from your history classes about the Boston Massacre. This happened, well, here's a little bit of background here. There had been protests in front of a shop in the Boston Square that was selling British goods. A British colonial official came and put a stop to the protests. The protesters then followed him back to his residence and continued to protest there. Over time, the crowd got bigger and rowdier and started throwing rocks through his windows. One of the rocks broke through his window, hit his wife, and knocked her down. He responded by going and getting his rifle, his musket rifle, loading it with birdshot and firing over the crowd. Unfortunately for him, some of it struck a 9-year-old boy and killed him. Of course, the dead kid only throws gasoline on this situation, and a little over a week later, we have what's become known as the Boston Massacre. And this happened when British soldiers fired on colonists who were protesting in front of a colonial governor's home. They killed 5 civilians. The protesters had been protesting there for hours. The crowd had gotten bigger and bigger until the British soldiers had been greatly outnumbered. One of them had been knocked down by a snowball, so it wasn't a completely unprovoked attack. This was, again, sort of angered both sides. Confirmation bias, as you could say. The British saw this as evidence that the colonials are out of control. Their view was, look, you've assaulted a colonial official, you vandalized his home, you assaulted a redcoat. These redcoats have the right to defend themselves. If you'd been behaving yourself, this wouldn't have happened. From the colonial perspective, it's that these soldiers are violating our rights as free citizens. We have the right to protest. It's sort of similar in some ways to like police shootings now, in that usually each side just interprets it as proof that they're right. So they see the same, both sides see the same event happen, but they're able to blame the other side because there's, as is often the case in the real world, there's usually some blame. It's pretty rare that one side is 100% blameless and the other side is 100% responsible. All right, so this, then should mention these soldiers that fired the shots. They were put on trial. They were defended by John Adams, who had no use for them, who was one of the strongest advocates for colonial rights, but who believed that in the rule of law and believed that even people who are unpopular, like these British soldiers, should have a fair trial. And they got a fair trial. Most of them were acquitted. I think a couple of them were convicted of a minor charge, and their punishment was they got a little brand on their thumbs. All right, fast forward 3 years, this resentment continues to grow, and in 1773 we get the Boston Tea Party. You probably heard of this, or I hope you have anyway. The British had repealed all the Townshend duties except for one tax on tea, and they actually cut that tax, but they gave the East India Company an exclusive right to sell tea in the colonies, and this angered the colonists because they didn't like this monopoly being imposed on them. And again, their view was Parliament is doing this without consulting us. We don't mind necessarily paying our taxes, but we should have some say in how these taxes are levied and how they're collected. So there's a general boycott of British tea as a result of this, and a ship arrives at Boston Harbor with tea and other goods. The colonials there ask for the clearance for the ship to disembark and leave, but the ship refuses to do it, so it simply sets in the harbor for several days. Eventually, a group of protesters, among them Samuel Adams, John Adams' cousin, and they named the beer after him, go in dressed as Mohawk Indians, take the tea, dump it in the ocean. This goes over very badly back in London, where they see this as terrorism. And so they pass what are called the Coercive or Intolerable Acts in 1774, again to try to bring the colonists back into line. These acts denied Massachusetts the right to charge British officials charged with capital offenses. In other words, any British soldier facing trial for murder had to be sent out of the colonies to receive a fair trial. The colonists called this the Murder Act. They also stated that colonists must quarter British soldiers in their private homes, even at times of peace. So if a British soldier knocks on your door and asks you to put them up for the night, you have to do it. This isn't popular either. And so there's a lot of anger here. By this point, the colonists and the division between the colonists and the British is probably too great. Something's going to break here. And Benjamin Franklin calls for a Continental Congress, which would include representatives from all 13 colonies to come together to try to deal with these colonial grievances. The idea being one colony alone can't stand up to the British, but all 13 of us together, maybe they'll listen. And the Continental Congress sent George III a list of grievances and asked him to intervene with Congress. They also agreed to meet again a year later in 1775. By their 1775 meeting, the first shots of the Revolution had already been fired, skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Emerson would later refer to the shots fired here as the shot heard round the world. This was in his Concord hymn of 1837. The background here is that about 700 British soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith were given orders to capture and destroy military supplies that were stored at the Massachusetts militia in Concord. The good news is the Patriot colonials, through their spies, had received word weeks in advance that this was going to happen, and they had already taken these supplies and moved them to other locations. At Northbridge and Concord, approximately 500 militiamen fought and defeated 3 companies of the King's troops. So it's a small battle, but the Patriots or the colonials win. So the fighting's already underway. Thomas is late, though, as January of 1776. It's estimated that a majority of the colonists still favored remaining part of Britain. They wanted to work out their differences peacefully and remain British subjects. Something which happened to change this was a book was published entitled Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine and published in January of 1776. And this book was a very well-written but inflammatory attack on the monarchy and on the British. It referred to George III as a royal brute, said the monarchy was founded on superstition and ignorance. The argument being that king rules by divine right of kings. And how do we know that George III rules because God wants him to? Because George III says so. Well, that's pretty convenient for George III, isn't it? His argument here is a government is illegitimate unless the people voluntarily submit to it. And he is arguing that a monarchy is like a holdover from the Middle Ages. It's inappropriate for an enlightened society. And everybody who could read would have read Common Sense. And public opinion, we think, and this is hard to measure because we didn't have polls back then, but many of the people at the time credited Common Sense with turning public opinion towards support for independence from the British. And in July 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduces a resolution declaring the colonies free from Great Britain. And they ultimately create a committee to write this Declaration of Independence. It would consist of 3 names you've heard of and 2 you haven't. I won't even give you the 2 names you haven't, but 3 you've heard of are Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. And they are tasked with writing a formal Declaration of Independence from the British. And so the logical person to do this was Ben Franklin, because he's the senior statesman. He's the most famous man in the colonies. He's already well known as a scientist. But he doesn't want to do it because he doesn't want to have his writing edited by a committee. So he passes on it. The next person in line would be John Adams, but he declines too because he feels that it would be better if Jefferson wrote it because, one, Jefferson's from Virginia, which is a moderate colony, whereas Adams is from Massachusetts, which is a more radical one. If Adams writes it, it might get dismissed as the ravings of a Massachusetts hothead. But if it's written by Jefferson from the more measured and moderate Virginia, then it'll be taken more seriously. Also, he argues that Jefferson is more well-liked than Adams, and also a better writer. So Jefferson ends up mostly writing the Declaration of Independence, which is approved by Congress on July 4, 1776. Declaration of Independence, like the Constitution, is heavily influenced by the Enlightenment. This was the sort of philosophical movement going on in Europe and North America at the time, which put a lot of faith in science and reason, things that could be empirically proven, was skeptical of tradition and superstition and things that could not be proven. Also, there was a belief among Enlightenment philosophers that human nature is essentially good, that humans are rational, and of course, if you believe in self-government and support self-government, you kind of have to believe that, because if you believe the people are not rational and not good, then you can't believe they're up to the task of self-government. Another figure would be John Locke, who's sort of the poster child of the Enlightenment. He wrote famously about separation of powers. He argued for 3 branches of government, as did Baron Montesquieu. He also argued for the idea of a social contract. That's the idea that you agree to live by the government's rules, and the government in response agrees to protect your rights. If one side breaks the contract, then it's no longer valid. So if you break the government's rules, you could be arrested. But if the government stops respecting your rights, then you're not bound by the government either. John Locke also argued that all humans had 3 natural rights, and those rights are life, liberty, and property, which sounds an awful lot like life, liberty, and happiness, which is in the Declaration of Independence. So, Revolutionary War is now underway. We won't talk about it too much here. That's more of a, we're more concerned about the formation of the government we have. And the United States of America is formally established by a new founding document called the Articles of Confederation. Before we have the Constitution, we have the Articles. And this is the first attempt by the colonies to create a new central government. And the government they create is incredibly weak and can't do much. It's defined in the Articles themselves as a league of friendship. There's no president, and each state gets 1 vote, regardless of the population of the state. So the biggest state and the smallest state get the same number of votes in this government. If you want to amend the Articles of Confederation, then you have to have unanimous agreement from all the states. So this is a Confederate government which leaves most of the power in the hands of the states. The reason why is because the founders saw the lesson of the British, of Parliament, and of George III. Too much central power can be dangerous. So they consciously created a government with almost no central power. So, however, they may have overcorrected here. Not everyone was thrilled about the Articles. Some of the people, the founders like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who were more in favor of a stronger national government, opposed it. And Madison actually called for a convention in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to try to strengthen the Articles of Confederation, but only 5 states bothered to send representatives. So most states actually didn't have any problem with the Articles of Confederation, at least not yet, because, governments typically don't want to give up their power, and creation of a new national government means state governments are ceding some power to a national authority. However, a year later, in 1787, something happens to change this. And this is called Shays' Rebellion. And this is led by a farmer from western Massachusetts named Daniel Shays. Shays was a veteran of the American Revolution. And the state of Massachusetts, however, had raised taxes to pay off their war debts. Taxes were so high that Shays and many farmers like him were unable to pay their taxes or mortgages. And their anger is, wait a minute, 10 years ago in 1776, we fought a war against the British over the issue of taxation. We won the war. Now we have a new government that's taxing us even more than the British did. If taking up arms against the British was the right thing to do in 1776, is it the right thing to do in 1787? A lot of people in the western Massachusetts thought so. And so they led a rebellion against the government of Massachusetts. Now, it wasn't a huge threat. It didn't succeed, but it did scare a lot of the states, leaders of the states, because the fear is if a movement like this were to succeed and overthrow one of the states, it would likely spread to other states. What happens if it succeeds? Well, we need a national government that could come in and restore order should that happen. And so this pushed most of our national leaders to come around to the idea of a stronger central government. One that's still limited, but one that is stronger than what the Articles of Confederation allows. So the lesson of the British is that too much centralized power is dangerous. The lesson we learn from the Articles of Confederation is that too little central power can also be dangerous. So in the summer of 1787, delegates from all 13 states meet in Philadelphia with a mandate to fix the Articles of Confederation. Pretty quickly, though, they decided the Articles of Confederation were a lost cause, and they just scrapped them and decided to write a new document, which is going to be the U.S. Constitution. Some of the major delegates at the Constitutional Convention were George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Gouverneur Morris, Elbridge Gerry, and others. Thomas Jefferson wasn't there. He was off in France serving essentially as an ambassador. John Adams wasn't there. He was off in England serving essentially as an ambassador there as well. Who were these? George Washington probably was the president. You probably hopefully heard of. He was president of the convention, but as president, he felt that it was his job to remain neutral, so he didn't really say much. He took, I think, a position on only one issue at the convention, and that was a relatively minor issue towards the end of it. Franklin was 81 years old at this point. He wasn't even lucid for much of the day. He had severe arthritis and was in quite a bit of pain, so he was not particularly influential either. Hamilton was influential, but maybe in the opposite way. He famously gave a 5-hour speech there, which turned a lot of the delegates off. Madison, sometimes called the father of the Constitution, which is A, true, but B, oversells it perhaps a little. Most of what we know about what happened at the convention comes from Madison's notes. Madison kept notes of the convention. All the delegates, though, were sworn to secrecy. The convention was closed to the public, and the delegates there weren't allowed to talk about what was going on. Madison, though, kept detailed notes, and it's from that we see what happened at the convention. The goal of this new Constitution is to create a government that's strong enough to govern, which is strong enough to maintain order, but would also protect individual liberty. So you're trying to strike the perfect balance here between a government powerful enough to maintain order, but one that's also going to protect individual rights. And this is a balancing act. It always has been. It's very much a work in progress. I don't know that we've achieved this perfectly today, and reality is there probably is no perfect solution because people are going to disagree. The summer of 1787, here's some sort of a side note, was extremely hot. People were crowded into the State House in Philadelphia. All the doors and windows were closed and locked. Obviously, there's no air conditioning yet. People in that time, gentlemen, dressed wearing layers. So it was miserable in there. And this probably had some effect on the Constitution we ended up with. It's hard to quantify exactly what, but probably a safe bet that at least contributed to flared tempers and lack of patience and things like that. What did the convention delegates look like? 55 men, no women, 33 lawyers, 8 businessmen, 6 planters, 3 physicians. Roughly half of them owned slaves. About half of them had a college degree. Most were actually fairly young. The average age was 43. This is skewed upward a little because Franklin, as I said, was 81. Not all were rich, but none were poor. Like I said, the doors and windows were locked. The press and the public couldn't attend, so the deliberations went on in secret. What influenced the founders? Number of things. John Locke, who we talked about already before, his concept of social contract, of natural rights. Baron Montesquieu, a French philosopher who suggested 3 branches of government. British law dating back to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a document that the British adopted in 1215, which restricted the power of the king. Basically said the king's rule is not arbitrary. The king has to follow the same laws as everyone else. This was the first step in power shifting away from the monarch into the parliament, process which has gone on for centuries. And today, of course, there's still a monarch in the UK, but they have almost no power. The power is actually exercised by the parliament. Common law, judges respect precedent, Mayflower Compact to some extent. Also, certain aspects of colonial governments. Most of the colonial governments had separation of powers. They all had written constitutions. Pennsylvania had a bicameral legislature, and all the states and colonies had elections. The first problem that we run into at this convention is a struggle between the big states and the little states, the states with large populations and the states with small populations. The controversy is, how are they, each side, going to be represented in this new government? Should each state get one vote, or should bigger states with bigger populations get more votes than smaller states with small populations? Two competing plans emerged to deal with this. The first is the Virginia plan, drafted by James Madison, which called for a new national government under a new constitution, a two-house legislature, lower house chosen by the people, an upper house chosen by the lower house. This new government would have the power to annul state laws. But probably the stumbling block here is that voting power of the states would be determined by their population. So the bigger states would get the most representatives, smaller states would get fewer representatives. This was popular. Virginia has the biggest population of any state at the time. And of course, this is going to be popular with New York and Pennsylvania, with the states that have big populations. The smaller states, though, are worried they're going to be swallowed whole. They don't like this idea because they feel they're not going to have any power. So one of the smaller states proposed a plan called the New Jersey Plan, proposed by New Jersey, which would declare Congress the supreme law of the land, give the new federal government the power of the tax. But, again, the stumbling block is each state is going to get one vote, regardless of population. And this created a log jam that looked like it might derail the whole process. We might not get a constitution at all. But ultimately, a compromise emerges from Connecticut. Connecticut's delegates propose what's now known as the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. And it reconciled the New Jersey and Virginia plans, took certain elements of each. We get a new National Congress, which is going to be divided into two chambers. The lower chamber, the House of Representatives, representation is going to be determined by population. So the bigger states, in terms of population, get more representatives. The smaller states, in terms of population, get fewer representatives. The second chamber, the upper chamber, is going to be the Senate. And each state gets 2 senators regardless of population. So ultimately, both sides are able to agree to this, and that's why we have the Congress that we have today. Another controversy is going to be nation versus state. There's a general consensus among the authors of the Constitution is we want a national government, but we also want state governments to retain some powers as well. Just the question is, how much power should be exercised at the national level, and how much power should states have? Figures like Alexander Hamilton were very much in favor of more national power. Hamilton actually saw states as impediments to good government. The other end, even though he wasn't president of the convention, Thomas Jefferson was a strong advocate for states' rights. He wanted a weaker federal government. So ultimately, we get some compromises here too. Congress is not given total power to govern, but instead is given a list of enumerated powers. Enumerated means written or listed. These are the powers that are listed in the Constitution. So Congress, per the Constitution, has the authority to tax, to provide for the general welfare, to regulate commerce, to borrow money, to declare war, to raise armies, and to make necessary and proper laws. And Congress is going to be the supreme law of the land. Well, that's all well and good, except for a couple things. One, what does general welfare mean? And two, what does necessary and proper mean? Sometimes these are called the elastic clauses because they're unclear. The people who wrote the Constitution itself disagreed on what these clauses meant. Today, most of what Congress does is not explicitly written into the Constitution, but they do it because it's considered for the general welfare or necessary and proper. So it created like a pretty broad leeway for Congress to do more than what is explicitly listed in the Constitution. All right, the last part and the least fun part to talk about is going to be the issue of slavery. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So said Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. It's ironic that he wrote that because Jefferson owned several hundred slaves. How can you, on the one hand, create a government based on consent of the governed, based on freedom and liberty, while at the same time enslaving other people? This is the original sin of our country. This is like the error code that's written into our program. You can't. This is a pretty big contradiction. And the founders themselves, pretty much all of them recognize this. Not all Northern delegates opposed slavery, not all Southern delegates supported it, but generally this was the division. The founders, many of them, including Jefferson himself, had negative views of slavery. Some of them were abolitionists, some were not. But they also were afraid. They also knew if they tried to abolish slavery altogether in the Constitution that Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware are likely to walk out and form their own separate country. So they made some unsavory compromises. The first is they're going to ban the international slave trade, but this isn't going to go into effect until 1808. Why? Because importing slaves is a big business. The second compromise is, how do we count slaves for population? We have to count the population periodically, right? Because we have to know, since house seats are given out based on state population, we have to know the population of each state. How do we count slaves for this purpose? Do we count them as full person? Do we not count them at all? The compromise is we're going to count 5 slaves as 3 people, hence the 3/5 clause. So a slave counts as 3/5 of a man. It was the pro-slavery people that wanted to count slaves fully as a person because it would give more power to their states. And it was the anti-slavery people that didn't want slaves to count at all. If you were a slave, you probably didn't want to count because it's not as if you get representation. It's just going to increase the representation for your owner. So the word slave itself doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution. Slaves are euphemistically called persons held in service. Doesn't appear, I should say, until the 13th Amendment, which is 1865, which abolishes slavery. But that's almost 90 years away. So what does this mean? Does this mean the founders were full of crap when they wrote this document, since they owned slaves and protected slavery? I would say no. This was the best compromise probably that they could get and keep everyone together. The founders were also guilty of, many of them, racism, of course. They were also probably guilty of having too much faith in the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment's view is that human nature is basically good and humans are rational. If you're a good and rational person, the only conclusion you can draw about slavery is that it's wrong, right? So their view was, as time goes on, as people become more educated, more enlightened, more and more people will come to see that slavery is bad, and they will voluntarily end slavery, and slavery will die out on its own. You probably know from history this is not at all what happened. We're eventually going to get a civil war because of this. So the founders probably put too much faith in human nature here. Over time, the actually opposite probably happens. All right, so the Constitution doesn't create a pure democracy. It creates a republic. Democratic republic, you could say. And there's many aspects of this new government that's not democratic. The Senate, for example, is not directly elected at first. Instead, senators are appointed by state legislatures. Not until 1913 that we get the direct election of U.S. senators. President, also not elected by the people, but elected by the Electoral College. Early on, electors, the Electoral College, were appointed by state legislatures. Today, they're voted by the people. Over time, the Constitution the U.S. has become more democratic. The franchise has increased. 1790, it would have mostly just been white men who owned property. Today, it's all U.S. citizens 18 years of age or older who are not convicted felons. The Senate's now directly elected, which it wasn't before. The president still not directly elected, but closer to it than they were before. All right, so the structure here, we'll talk about all these in more detail later in the course, but the first article of the Constitution establishes Congress, or the legislative branch. You might have been told that the Constitution creates 3 co-equal branches of government. Wrong. The founders view the Congress should be the most powerful branch of government. And it is, and I can prove it to you. Congress has the authority to override vetoes by the president. President cannot make a law, though, without Congress. So Congress can make a law without the president, but the president can't make a law without Congress. Congress also has the ability to impeach the president. So Congress can get rid of the president. President can't get rid of members of Congress. Congress has to pass legislation to pay for anything the president or the courts do. Congress controls president and the courts' pay. Congress can impeach justices of the Supreme Court. Congress can draw judicial districts and abolish them. So Congress can get rid of justices too, but justices can't get rid of members of Congress. Bottom line is Congress is the most powerful branch of government. Congress is bicameral, means it has 2 chambers, House and the Senate. The House members are directly elected by their districts and serve 2 years per term, and you must be at least 25 years of age when you run for the House. Senate, you have to be at least 30 years of age, and you represent an entire state, and you serve a 6-year term. And there's 2 representatives, or 2 senators per state. Any bill to levy taxes must originate in the House. Congress has the authority to override presidential vetoes. It takes a 2/3 vote of both chambers to do it. Congress has the power to borrow and coin money, pass all laws necessary and proper, power to impeach, which we talked about. And the Senate has authority to ratify treaties, not the House. It takes a 2/3 vote of the Senate, though, to ratify a treaty. Next branch is going to be the executive branch, and that's going to be the president and president's cabinet. This is the branch which scared the founders the most, because if we ever got a king or a dictator in this country, it is much easier to imagine them coming from the executive branch than from Congress or from the Supreme Court. The executive branch consists of the president, who's elected by the Electoral College for a 4-year term. In order to serve as president, you must be eligible to be president. You have to be 35 years of age, a resident of the USA for the previous 14 years, and a natural-born citizen. What does natural-born citizen mean? It means either you were born in the United States or you were born in a foreign country to an American citizen. So if you're born in another country, but at least one of your parents is an American citizen, you inherit their citizenship. So you're a citizen from birth. Ted Cruz, for example, was born in Canada, but he's eligible to run for president because his parents were Americans. The only person not eligible to run for president would be a naturalized citizen. We'll talk more about this later on. President has the power to veto, the power to pardon. We'll talk about these later on when we talk about the presidency. Also, as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, makes treaties, appoints ambassadors and judges, has to have consent of the Senate in these as well. The third branch, and viewed by the founders as the weakest branch, is the judicial branch. Alexander Hamilton famously referred to the judicial branch as the least dangerous branch of government. The Constitution, because it was seen as one of the weaker branches and less dangerous ones, the Constitution doesn't specify a lot of what the exact role of the Supreme Court is. Marbury versus Madison created the concept of judicial review. That's the ability of the courts to review actions by the president or by the Congress, and President and Congress and possibly strike them down. But this isn't explicitly in the Constitution. We'll talk about this when we talk about the judiciary later on. Constitution can be amended, and there's two ways to do it. One is 2/3 of each chamber of Congress approve an amendment. Then it goes out to the states, and 3/4 of the states have to approve it. Second method would be 2/3 of the states request a national constitutional convention. A convention is then held, which proposes amendments. The amendments then get sent back to the states, and each amendment approved by a 3/4 vote of the state gets added to the Constitution. The Constitution has been, all amendments to the Constitution have been done through the first method. The second method has never been done. It has been attempted a few times, but never actually pulled off, although it could happen. The second method is a way to amend the Constitution through bypassing Congress. So actually, if the Constitution were to be amended today, there may be a good chance the second method would be used, since Congress is, as of right now at least, isn't able to get much done. Founders were, as always, very worried about power, about institutions becoming too powerful, so they divided the power up through a number of ways. One is through federalism. We'll talk about this soon. Federalism is the division of power between national governments and state governments. So we have some powers at the federal level, some at the state levels. Separation of powers, we divide power up between the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. They all have independent areas of power, and they all keep each other in check through checks and balances. The president gets out of hand, Congress kicks him back in. If Congress gets out of hand, the president can do the same. Courts can strike down actions by presidents and by Congress. So the idea being that if one branch becomes corrupt, the others will keep them honest. Now, some limits on government power. 10th Amendment says powers not delegated to the national government are delegated to the states or to the people. States are prohibited by the Constitution from coining money or engaging in foreign affairs. They can't pass bills of attainder. They can't pass ex post facto laws. A bill of attainder is when a law is passed declaring someone guilty of a crime. So Congress can't pass a law declaring Casey Anthony guilty of murder. Ex post facto law is a law enforced after the fact. So if someone does something you don't like, you can't prosecute them for it unless it was illegal at the time they did it. So in other words, if we pass a law that goes into effect on January 1st, 2020, you can't prosecute someone for violating that law on December 31st, 2019. Habeas corpus can't be suspended except in times of invasion or rebellion. Habeas corpus means produce the corpse. In Latin, what this means is if you're arrested, the government has to either charge you with something or let you go. So they can't just arrest you, put you in jail, and leave you there forever. They have to bring charges against you. And, of course, in order to do that, they have to have evidence to warrant charges. All right, so the Constitution's been written now. It's been sent out for ratification. And there's disagreement over how best to create a new government. You have two factions emerge here, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And they disagree on the Constitution over the concept of a Bill of Rights. The Federalists support the ratification of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. They're going to be people like John Adams, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton. They're going to argue, they wrote the Federalist Papers, which were published in newspapers in New York, which were arguments in favor of the Constitution. They hope to sway people to support it. Primarily written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay were the primary authors of this. Their argument against a Bill of Rights is that it is impossible to list all the rights that a citizen should have in a free country. And if we try to do this, we'll inevitably leave some out. And the government may respect the ones we list, but it'll ignore the ones we leave out. So it's best to leave this flexible. The Anti-Federalists, led by people like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, strongly disagreed. They felt the Constitution didn't adequately protect individual rights, and they believed that a list of rights should be included. And they wrote a series of essays called the Anti-Federalist Papers in opposition to the Constitution. Ultimately, the Anti-Federalists get what they want. They get the Bill of Rights, and they end up supporting the Constitution. All right, so Necessary and Proper Clause, General Welfare Clause. We've talked about these already. Again, these are sometimes called elastic clauses because they're so vague. What is the general welfare? What is necessary and proper? Well, this is up to the individual's opinions. My opinion and your opinion may be different. So Congress has a lot of leeway here in what they can do because of this, because it's so vague and unspecific. All right, Bill of Rights. You're supposed to read them for this week. I'm going to go through and talk to you about the amendments in another lecture, so make sure you watch that. We'll go ahead. Actually, I'll go ahead and skip over these two because we're going to talk about them in the other lecture. All right, interpretation. This is where things get dicey. What does it mean? What does necessary and proper mean? What does general welfare mean? What does a well-regulated militia mean? We don't agree on what these terms mean. It's not surprising, though, that the authors of the Constitution themselves disagreed on what the Constitution actually meant. So it can be hard to understand for sure. We can say federal authority has certainly expanded in the 2 centuries since it was written. We can all have opinions on what the Constitution means, but ultimately the Supreme Court is the institution that gets the final say, the say that matters. Other changes have happened. There's nothing about political parties, at least originally in the Constitution. Founders view they hope that leaders would put aside factions and govern in the best interest of the country. Obviously, that may or may not have happened, but political parties are really integral to our political system now. Hard to imagine government without the Democrats and Republicans. Divided government's common too, as we have as of right now. And in April of 2019, we have Republican president, Republican Senate, Democratic House of Representatives. So when this happens, getting things done becomes very difficult. All right. America's a new nation, and what I mean by this is it's not based on ethnicity or race, but rather on ideals. Commitment to the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. We're not all Americans because we're the same ethnic group, because we're the same race, or whatever. What makes us Americans is that we believe in liberty and freedom and human rights. That's how it's supposed to work. How well have we applied these ideas? Well, America's still as Reagan said, or actually not, Reagan said it, but originally John Winthrop said, the shining city on the hill, right? That's true. More being complete, but true. Many colonies who won independence have become unstable or collapsed. Yugoslavia, Zimbabwe, Vietnam, Haiti are examples of this. One reason that we've endured might be our Constitution and the fact that it can be changed. When he was leaving the Philadelphia Convention, a woman approached Benjamin Franklin on the street, or so the story goes, and asked, "What kind of government have you given us, Mr. Franklin?" And Benjamin Franklin's response was, "A republic if you can keep it." And of course the question is, and always has been, how well have we kept it? And that is a question I don't have the answer to. I want you to think about that. And I will talk to you again in just a few minutes to discuss constitutional amendments. Have a good day.